The marks for a community that is under the Midianite curse is essentially the same. The root cause is that they've refused to do what God has called them to do, and you find a curse on time. I share this next portion with a great deal of grief. Across the millennia of Israel's history, they have dealt with a Midianite curse. There is a season of 21 days from the 17th of Tammuz to the 9th of Av. That is on their calendar. It is a lunar calendar, so it varies from year to year for us. And across the millennia, there's been a huge devouring and a devastation of Jewish life and Jewish resources, Jewish freedom during that window. The window this year in our calendar is from June 27th to July 18th of the year 2002. In 1648, looking just at one day, we're talking a 21-day period where there's a horrendous amount of damage to Israel. Looking just at the last day, the 9th of Av, this is the record that one researcher gave me. In 1648, there was a major massacre of Polish Jews on the 9th of Av. In 1492, on this date, the Jewish expulsion from Spain was supposed to be complete. In 1306, the Jews on this day were expelled from France. In 1290, the Jews on this day were expelled from England. In 1096, the First Crusade began, and the Crusades were, of course, a butchery of the Jewish people in Israel at that time. It was in 70 A.D. on the 9th of Av that the temple was destroyed by Titus the Roman. It was in 586 B.C. that Solomon's temple was destroyed on the 9th of Av. Why? Why all of this defilement coming in to Israel's history? It is because, according to the Jewish historians, it was on the 9th of Av in 1200 B.C. that Israel was judged by God for refusing to go into the Promised Land. God's agenda was for them to take possession of Palestine. And in order to do that, they would have to use God's resources. Yes, there were giants in the land. Yes, there were walled cities. God was absolutely in agreement with them on that piece of data. But God's power was more than enough to accomplish all of that. And He gave them an opportunity to fulfill their stewardship. They did not have a right to bypass their blessing. It wasn't just for them. God wanted to position them there to be a blessing to the nations of the world. And when they refused to pursue God's agenda, when they refused to put themselves at risk, when they didn't want to risk losing what comfort they had, the defilement of time entered the Jewish nation, and it has pursued them for these thousands of years. There is no evidence that this curse has been broken off of Israel. I shudder at what could be coming between the 27th of June and the 18th of July as you look at the acceleration of death, violence, and destruction in Israel in the last 4 weeks. One wonders if the enemy is getting ready to attack in a vicious way one more time. I would remind you of all of the times in recent history and in past history when Israel has been attacked on their holidays. The Yom Kippur War is one of the most recent memories. The bomb blast on Passover in just this last year. Again and again, the Midianite curse has brought death and destruction to Israel on their holidays. I mention this also because of New York City with its gift of giving. I have not been able to trace any particular defilement of time there. I just know that it is a distinct possibility because of their gift of giving. And I would encourage you to be much in prayer for God to restore the foundations during this season, and if He would, to have mercy on a city that may be under the Midianite curse. What is the opposite of stewardship? Very simply, it is ownership. And the gift of giving is so prone to ownership, using God's resources for themselves. God has not called us to own. In the Old Testament, there was a measure of ownership. You gave your tithe, and you owned the rest, and you could do what you want. But in the New Testament, God is very plain. He wants it all. Every single thing that we are and that we have belongs to Him, and He lays ownership to it. Let's look now at the life of Christ. We talked about the strings that are attached by a carnal giver. So often a carnal giver will do a favor with intent to create an IOU that he can call in the future. Christ did endless miracles for people, including those in position of power, and yet He never, ever attempted to leverage a gift that He had given, a miracle that He had done, in order to receive a favor back from people. I'm impressed with the fact that He understood God's agenda for Him. His agenda was not to fix every problem in Israel. His call, what God wanted Him to do, was to prepare 12 men to change the face of human history. And so He was able to turn aside from so many of the distractions and to focus on that particular call that God had for Him. He also allowed His physical needs to be in evidence during that time. He could have miraculously supplied His own needs. The giver desires to be able to meet His own needs, to have His own security assured, and then out of that position of security to give to others. And we see Him tired and thirsty at the well in Samaria. He never used God's power to avoid pain for Himself. We read that there were women that followed Him, and they met His needs at different times. That's Mark chapter 15, verse 14. He allowed Himself to be dependent on the body of Christ. The fifth miracle in the Gospel of John is the healing of the man who was born blind. Again, Christ avoided every semblance of creating dependence by healing the man partially, putting the mud on his eyes, and making the man own the rest of the process. The man had to find his way to the pool of Siloam to wash before he had sight. As we look at the words on the cross, the fifth thing that Jesus said was, "I thirst." And the most delegitimizing thing for a giver is to be so needy that he has to ask for provision from somebody else, particularly somebody that he does not respect. And yet Christ on the cross, in His anguish, expressed His need. He was thirsty, and He allowed one of His enemies, somebody far below Him in any social standard, to meet a physical need of His.